Venom was not a failure at all. Venom was frickin' amazing. WTF.
Venom.
Hey, don't listen to this guy. This review is a failure. Venom was good as his clickbait.
Not too long ago, I made a video about Venom where I concluded that most of the issues that movie had originated from just one section of it, the prologue. A lot of you did kindly inform me that the movie was still good and a success, and that's fine, but I do still think that it would have been a lot better if only the prologue had been slightly fixed. Well, strangely, now it turns out there's another new Hollywood blockbuster that suffers from the same problem as Venom, the exact same prologue problem. Only this time the problem is much more severe, to the point where it completely destroyed the entire film, commercially, critically, in every way possible. The film in question is 2018's Robin Hood. If I had to describe Robin Hood with a single word, the most fitting choice to use probably would be the word generic. There are some nice Guy Ritchie-like visuals here, but for the most part, the movie doesn't really have too much to offer. To put it bluntly, everything about it just feels so uninspired and derivative of other big Hollywood blockbusters, like down to the music. Uninspiredness and other surface level stuff aside, just like was the case with Venom, all of the real major issues of Robin Hood could be seen to originate from just one section, its opening 17-minute prologue. And if you haven't seen Robin Hood, the prologue section goes like this. We're in England to get some quick voiceover about Robin and Marion falling in love. Then we're in some Arabic country to watch some action sequences. And then the movie jumps back to England and properly begins. And now, after the prologue, Robin has lost everything important to him, including the love of his life. Sound familiar? Sadly to Robin Hood, the Venom-like prologue problem in this movie is much worse than it was in Venom. The reason for this is that the prologue section here is completely disconnected from the rest of the film. Even though Venom's prologue section was flawed, at least it built some narrative elements that actually came into play later on. Here, that's not the case. Here, pretty much everything the prologue section does never amounts to anything. And so, here we are. Let's take a look at 2018's Robin Hood and try to figure out why its prologue section feels like such a disconnected, separate entity, and how this disconnected prologue creates issues that ended up ruining the rest of the film. Then, once we know the issues, we'll try to change the prologue into a more connected form, in a way that would perhaps have made this movie a bit less of a critical and commercial failure. In order to work, every movie in existence requires clear, logical motivations from the main characters. Usually, the purpose of the opening sections and acts of movies is always to set up these character motivations, which then causes the rest of the story to happen. But of course, because the opening section of Robin Hood is so entirely disconnected from the rest of the movie, no clear logical motivations are ever properly constructed. And by that I mean all the goals and motivations of the protagonists in Robin Hood pretty much make no sense. If we want to understand Robin's motivations, we first have to understand the motivations of Jamie Foxx, since Jamie Foxx is the one who pushes Robin on the path to become Robin Hood. In the prologue, Jamie Foxx is introduced as an Arabic fighter who has to watch his son get brutally executed by a douchebag English soldier. And accordingly, his motivation for the rest of the film seems very clear and logical. He wants to avenge his son by killing the douchebag soldier. Only that's not the motivation the movie chooses. Instead of seeking to avenge his son, Jamie Foxx follows Robin to Nottingham and then wants his help to end the war by stealing a bunch of money from the Sheriff of Nottingham, because apparently this one single town holds all of England's war funding or something. To be clear, the main goal of robbing Nottingham to end the war, that's fine. But if that is your main goal, why was it never properly set up? Why was it never established anywhere in the prologue that Nottingham is the town that funds the war? If Jamie Foxx, for example, heard that information in the Arabic country, then it would make sense that he follows Robin to Nottingham. But to have him first follow Robin to Nottingham just cause and only then conveniently hear that, oh, you can stop the war by stealing money from Nottingham. No, you can't set up a personal revenge story against one certain antagonist only to then make the story about something entirely else. As to Robin's motivations, they kind of don't exist.
So John, he's the one who dragged me into this. All I wanted was to get you back.
Like you just said, Robin in this movie does stuff only because Jamie Foxx tells him to. He does apparently want Marian back too, but his actions don't really support or relate to that motivation. You could also argue that Robin wants to take revenge on the sheriff because he sent him off to the war. But if so, maybe this rivalry between him and the sheriff should have actually been established in a bit better way than just quickly showing a name on a paper. But we'll get to that next. If your movie is about a guy stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, maybe give that guy a proper reason to do so. Your prologue can have cool action war scenes, but you also need to establish your protagonist's motivations for the rest of the story. If that motivation is love, then properly establish that love. If that motivation is rivalry, then properly establish that rivalry. As long as you establish something that naturally takes us from the prologue to the rest of the story. As mentioned, the second issue created by the prologue of Robin Hood is that it never establishes the movie's villain. When Robin is in England with Marian, there's no interactions with any antagonist. When he's in the Arabic country fighting the locals, there still is no real story antagonist. You could say that the douchebag English soldier does get set up for later, yeah, but not only does the soldier never amount to much anyway, he's not the main villain of the story either. Then, after 25 long minutes of screen time, we finally meet the real main villain of Robin Hood, the Sheriff of Nottingham. The problem is, at this point in time, there's absolutely no reason for the audience to view him as the villain, simply because so far the movie has done nothing to establish him as the villain. Obviously, every villain doesn't have to be revealed as evil right away. A movie can give hints about the villain being evil first and pay them off later, of course. For example, maybe the sheriff has some kind of deep personal rivalry with Robin. Maybe that's why he sent him off to the war, maybe that's why he pronounced him as dead and destroyed his legacy. But no, none of that is the case here. The sheriff has no ill will towards Robin. He doesn't seem to have ill will towards anyone. Even though Robin and Jamie Foxx are convinced that he's evil and that he deserves to be taken down, the only reason the audience has to think that is because he's the Sheriff of Nottingham and he was evil in the other Robin Hood movies. In fact, the sheriff in this movie is pretty much never established as the villain. Just the opposite, he seems like a nice guy leader who's doing his best in tough times. Yeah, he does collect taxes and he does draft people for the war, but that's what happens in wartime. That's not evil, that's his job. Even when the film is desperately going out of its way to make the sheriff evil, we never actually see him do any bad stuff. All he does do is talk about doing bad stuff.
I'll take the commoners for everything they've got, and when that is done, I will burn their shit slums to the ground.
The elites shouldn't be surprised by the thieves' revolution. You created the conditions for it.
Marian?
You created the conditions for it.
Marian?
Burn their shit slums to the ground.
You created the conditions for it.
Marian?
Objectively speaking, the real bad guy villain of this movie probably is Robin. I mean, here we have this financially important town gathering funds for the war. The guards can get a bit rough from time to time, but I don't think they ever kill anyone. And suddenly, this masked dude shows up to wreak havoc and steal all that money and toss it into the dirt, so that the sheriff has to collect it from the people all over again. Not only that, Robin also kills and murders guards as if their lives meant nothing. And at the end, Robin also fucking executes the sheriff and leaves him hanging on display like some freaking Mexican drug lord from Sicario. Nobody likes to pay taxes, yeah, but this is on a whole other level. In the Disney version of Robin Hood, the sheriff was a true bad guy. He personally stole from the poor, he cheated, he tried to force himself on Marion. Here, that's not the case, especially not in the prologue. The movie never establishes the sheriff as evil. It never establishes a connection between him and Robin, not until the very end when the new sheriff takes over. And that just makes me wonder, why wasn't this guy the villain from the start? Perhaps the biggest issue of the prologue section in Robin Hood is that it doesn't properly establish any of the core relationships that the rest of the movie is built on. Take Robin and Marion for example. Their love relationship between these two characters arguably is the heart of the film, and the only way the film can work is if the audience believes that these two actually love each other. But that's pretty hard to do when the total amount of time spent on establishing this love is a single 2-minute scene, plus some quick voice-over visuals. You know, because we need to get to those war action sequences that have nothing to do with the story overall. Then there's the relationship between Robin and the sheriff. As we discussed, there are some initial hints at a rivalry between them. The sheriff sends Robin off to war and then wrongly declares him as dead. But then it turns out it's all just a coincidence that happens because the plot needs it to happen in order to exist. So again, never mind. Next, there's also Robin's relationship with the people of Nottingham. Since this movie is about helping these poor people, you'd think that it would make us care about them. But of course, it never properly does. We are told that these people are unfairly oppressed, but we never actually see that happen, at least not in a big way until over an hour into the movie. Plus, more importantly, we don't have any perspective into the townspeople, because there's no one townspeople character that we know and care about. There is Marion, but she wasn't properly built either. The relationship the prologue does do very well is the one between Robin and Jamie Foxx, and between them and the douchebag English soldier. When the soldier orders Jamie Foxx's son to be executed, you can really feel the hatred Jamie Foxx has for him. Same also with Robin. And so, it just makes me wish that this soldier had been more of a key villain of the movie. He does come into play later on, but not in a meaningful enough way. Jamie Foxx, for example, never faces him to avenge his son. Instead, Robin and Jamie Foxx just brutally murder the sheriff, who's done nothing bad to either of them. Again, your opening section can have big action scenes and fights and whatever, but you also have to properly set up the main key relationships of your film. And when I say properly set up, I mean in a bit more powerful way than just some random voiceover that tells us that two characters care about each other. Because if you don't, if you spend most of your opening on stuff that's disconnected from everything else and try to establish those relationships later, odds are they aren't going to work as effectively. Now that we've identified the core issues of the disconnected prologue, let's see if we can make the prologue a bit more connected to the rest of the story. And lucky for us, a lot of the possible fixes have already come up on their own. Firstly, in order to fix the nonsensical disconnected motivations, all the motivations and goals of this movie have to be unified. As in, the motivations that the prologue sets up, those are the motivations that the characters have for the rest of the movie. And the best way to accomplish this is by making the douchebag English soldier one of the key villains. Instead of first being introduced as a bad guy and then just tossed aside, the soldier should serve as some kind of a leader guard in Nottingham. Now it makes sense that Jamie Foxx follows the soldier and Robin to Nottingham. Now it makes sense that he wants to bring the leaders of Nottingham down. He does still want to end the war, but he also wants to avenge his son, like the movie first so clearly sets up. Unfortunately, this still doesn't solve the problem of Robin not having proper motivations. But luckily, that could maybe be fixed by fixing the second prologue-related issue, which is the missing main villain. In order to make the sheriff work as the main villain, the prologue section has to create a clear connection between him and Robin. And the right way to do this that I see is to take the sheriff and Marion's new husband who becomes the next sheriff at the end and combine them into one. In the prologue, the movie should show us full scenes to establish a rivalry between Robin and the sheriff. Maybe they grew up as enemies, maybe they both had feelings for Marion, and Robin ultimately ended up getting her. And because of it, the newly appointed sheriff now intentionally sends Robin away to war. Maybe he even orders the douchebag soldier to leave Robin for dead so that he can destroy his legacy and be with Marion. And now, after being left for dead with Jamie Foxx for a couple years, maybe as prisoners or something, Robin finally returns to Nottingham to see that the sheriff has wiped out his name and taken the love of his life. So of course, he wants to bring the sheriff down by becoming Robin Hood. Now we have clear motivations. Now we have clear personal villains. By fixing the first two issues, you kind of at the same time also fix the third issue of relationships. Since you already built a rivalry relationship between Robin and the sheriff, you at the same time built Robin's relationship with Marion. And by making Robin be left for dead with Jamie Foxx, you also built their relationship as well. And as to the townspeople, the best way to build a relationship there is to give Robin some childhood friends from Nottingham who serve in the army with him. This way, when Robin finally returns to Nottingham, he has a direct perspective into the hardship faced by the townspeople, because his friends are here and part of the townspeople. This way, you can make the audience care about the people of Nottingham. Putting all these fixes quickly out like that, it might seem like there's a lot of new stuff to add to the movie. And yeah, it would all probably make up the entire first act, which I don't think is a bad thing. In Batman Begins, for example, we don't see Batman until the midpoint. And just like Batman Begins, you don't have to tell this new first act linearly. You can do it non-linearly and jump from one important event to another. Plus, if you cut out some of the more redundant stuff like the subplot of Robin posing as a douchey rich guy that leads nowhere, you can pretty easily keep the total runtime around the same as it is now. So, there you have it. Is this new, more connected version of the movie good? Would it have made billions at the box office? I don't know. But as to the question of whether or not it would have been less of a failure than the version that we got, I think so.